So let me go ahead and introduce our speakers again. Thrilled to have them. Dr. Kim Akass is professor of radio, television, and film at Rowan University. She has co-edited and contributed to several books in the Reading Contemporary Television series and is one of the founding editors of the television journal Critical Studies in Television, the International Journal of Television Studies from SAGE. Also managing editor of the website CST Online, and is a series editor of Reading Contemporary Television. And her book, Mothers on American Television, From Here to Maternity, was published by Manchester University Press in 2023. And also, I believe, was just nominated for the Catherine Singer Kovacs Book Award for 2024-2025. And Dr. Andimo spent 20 plus years in higher education as a professor at Vanderbilt University, Syracuse University, and Penn State University. She now works as a student support specialist in the School of International Affairs at Penn State and serves on the State College Area School District School Board. A past recipient of the National Communication Association's Golden Monograph Award, her articles have appeared in Quarterly Journal of Speech, Critical Studies in Media Communication, Rhetoric and Public Affairs, and Women's Studies in Communication. And she is also the co-editor of the Mother Business, Communication, Consumption, and Privilege. So again, thrilled to have both of you with us today. If we could get started, and I guess Kim will go with you first, and then Anne, to talk to us a little bit about how your perhaps personal experiences, I know this is a question the students had, how your personal experiences led to the research agenda that you have.
Oh God, yeah, so easy for me. I I was a mature student and went to university when my son was 3, which was many eras ago. And I was studying at the time women's cinema and came across Laura Mulvey, who is like the queen of film studies. And specifically, I did a whole course on her article, Visual Pleasures and Others, and Visual and Other Pleasures. And that, for anybody that doesn't know it, that's about women just not looking, women being looked at and being objectified. So I was taking my son to the cinema, and I've got this in the prologue to the book, and it kind of occurred to me that there are no mothers on screen in children's films, and that kind of started me thinking. I mean, obviously there's narrative reasons for it, but realized as well I was the first of my friends to have children, and trying to combine studying and childcare when childcare is so expensive was just impossible. I mean, I did it, but I was pulling my hair out. And then I went to do my MA in film and television, and was pregnant with my second child. And that was impossible as well. I had to write my dissertation while I was breastfeeding with one hand and kind of typing with the other. And there are a number of things that occurred to me, which is, why am I expected to be the principal caregiver? Number one, usually because my wages were not as good as my husband's. And I was lucky to have a husband at that time that was supporting me. But it just, the whole thing about being the sole carer of children seemed so unfair, unpaid, unappreciated, and really there was no reason for it except that it was cultural and societal expectations. And then as studying TV, I started noticing that women are demonized when they become mothers if they're working. And then there was the mommy wars happened at the beginning of the 90s. So everything kind of comes from my experience of being a mother, being expected to be at home with a child. And I remember thinking very clearly, where does it say that I should get all of my stimulation from being with a baby? Because they're not very good conversationalists, let's be honest. And it doesn't matter how much you love your kids and how much you love being a mom, everybody deserves to be able to do something else. So that's kind of my research trajectory. The book took me 10 years to write because I was mothering rather than writing about mothering. And it was literally only coming here, and thanks to the pandemic, that I was locked away from my kids and could spend a whole summer writing my research up. So it's, my research into caregiving and women has been absolutely formed from my subjective experience.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Anne.
Yeah, so it's interesting because my research initially didn't actually deal with motherhood, so that the edited volume that I worked on really came out of a lived experience in that I saw a real connection between mothering and consumption. And I think trying to understand the economics of motherhood, not just in terms of pay, but also mothers are kind of the primary buyers. And so thinking through that in terms of a lens of economics was what prompted the edited volume that I worked on. But in terms of like my personal experience, in addition to the research on motherhood and consumption, I actually made a really significant right turn in my research as well. My son is on the autism spectrum. And so one of the last articles I did before I kind of turned away from academia and started going into more student support and running for school board was to write an article about apps that are sold to families that are supposed to help students or children who have autism. So that I think you can kind of just see, even in just Kim's answer and my answer, that the lived realities of a scholar or a professional, if you're not in academia, can kind of drive your professional interests or your scholarly interests, in that you're trying to make sense of what you are seeing on the ground. But I also want to kind of put a little peg in. I didn't have my son until I was 38. I'm not sure when Kim and Julie had their children, but I do think that there is still a generational difference. I looked at the average mother right now is 27 years old. And so I do think that there is a important generational component to all of this that I'd like to keep in mind. I'm thinking about that in particular because the Generation Z folks are more thrifters. And so that might actually kind of completely challenge some of the consumption research about motherhood. So I hope that we can kind of toggle back and forth between our generation of mothering and what the students might be experiencing as they move forward. But I do think the economics of motherhood is really, to sum it up, what kind of drew me to this subject area.
I think that's a really great point to bring up, because we should also acknowledge our own positionality in this. So I am, a white, cisgender, straight woman, academic. And so the issues of race and class and circumstance, I think definitely, and generation, I think is a really, really good point. And I've been reading a lot too about the trad wife trend that's going on with, I think that's Gen Z, but might be millennials. I don't know. I'll need some of my interns are on the call. Y'all, Simran and Lindsay need to let me know. Where's the trad wife? Is it? But this whole idea of having large families and doing a more traditional life. What struck me at what you were saying, and again, from my own experience, the thing that I always think about and laugh about is I came to Rowan before I finished my dissertation and had a difficult time finishing it because I was so involved in working. And I finished I had my dissertation defense 5 days before my son was due, 6 days before my son was born. So it was sort of this pedal to the metal that I had to finish. um, here. And I think that that comes from lack of social supports, perhaps lack of, right. So I'm just wondering your thoughts on that too. And again, we're women in academia, and I had my children when I was 32 and 36, so could be a little younger as well. What do you think accounts for the lack of social supports, or could you guess that, or how does that fit into depictions in the media?
I've just got a quote from my own book, so just
There you go.
self-publishing. I'm right. So I was writing about the adaptation of a Danish series to an American series, and how is The Killing, Faubourg Delson to The Killing, and they kind of liberally adapt it, but they keep the characters the same, and until it becomes comes to the representation of motherhood. And so Sarah Lund in Faubourg Delson is a terrible mother. She puts her job really in front of everything. Her son is like, so far not on the radar with her, but she's never judged. That's just her, and people support her, and her mother's there to help her. It's all fine, but it's not, but it is, it works. When it comes to America, she is absolutely vilified for putting the case before her motherhood. And it's really interested me, because it's kind of the same narrative, but adapted from a different country. Now, the Nordic countries are really good at supporting families. And just in terms of childcare, they have, they have a total of 52 weeks of leave containing maternity, paternity, and parental. 52 weeks of leave after you've had a child for all, both. You don't have to be the mum. That's amazing. Once the first year of parental leave is over, Denmark provides daycare facilities for all children from the age of 26 weeks to 6 years, because they recognize that, this is a quote, proper daycare facilities are a necessity for women's full-time participation in the labour market on equal terms with men. If you compare that to America, where there's absolutely no maternity leave, unless you're in a company with 50 or more employees, and then it's only voluntary. The company doesn't have to give you that. High childcare expenses, and there is a societal expectation, especially currently with our lovely government, that just expects it to be women to stay at home to look after the children. And I think that really shows how it works in TV for me, that the country with the best cultural policies for economic policies for families give the best childcare, and they don't expect it to be for women. They expect fathers to be at home as well, whereas in America it's totally different. So I think that's how it impacts on women. Women's wages are still less than men's. There's no way of getting away from that. Women get paid less than men. So when it comes to staying at home with the kids, whose salary is going to go? It's got to be the women's. So that's a kind of unequal distribution, and I think that's how it impacts women in whatever country you're in. You can see the impact of the policies on having children.
I just would like to kind of jump in terms of thinking about this lack of flexibility. I want to anchor it in that the norm is childcare is upwards of $1,000 a month, particularly when you have super young ones. And so in one of the things that doing work on the intersection of consumption and motherhood, you'll find is that you have, people like Rutgers, the Center for Women in Work, do excellent work, but surprisingly, also the different advertising organizations are really key to understand the kind of internal dynamics of mothers because it's to their economic benefit to do so. And so there's this one kind of website that's like a go-to for young mothers, and it's called, I think, Maverly. And they did a focus group survey, and they found that 2/3 of moms consider leaving the workforce last year due to stress and the cost of childcare. And why that's important is that the highest is among Gen Z at 82%. So you can certainly complicate that study, but I really think it's important to think about the cost and like give us dollar amounts of what average folks are paying for what childcare costs. And so that's a component to understanding the weight that families carry into this choice. And then also the recognition that the labor in the home is not spread equally. The sense of identity, I mean, I'd be interested to see what some of your students have to say about this. So Pew also did a study which talked about women seeing their identity as tied to motherhood. Fathers, less so much. Now, this is assuming a heterosexual couple, but so that when you put that together, that expectation of identity and motherhood being tied really goes back to what that important point Kim said, is that the media drives that. Your traditional wives on TikTok drives that. And so I think that's something to kind of anchor it, but also think about how when parents have children whose identity is more tied to caregiving, and why? How is that reinforced and how is that rewarded?
Yeah, it's a really excellent point, and because it also seems to me that gets at the crux of this women needing their identities tied up with motherhood, at the crux of this larger conversation that's going on politically in the country, because to be a mother is expected. There's this default, and obviously we know lots of people cannot become mothers, don't want to be mothers. There's choice in the matter, but I think that this idea that women are by default will become mothers, and that's part of the identity, is what sort of baffles certain people about, if you aren't a mother, you're not valuable. Because that to me is just an important conversation to be having as the complexities facing mothers in contemporary culture. Does that make sense? Like it's also this idea that's where you're supposed to have your identity from, is being a mother.
Absolutely. I mean, I just again looked at, I can never remember this stuff. I can't believe I wrote this because I can never remember it. But it says that there's a motherhood penalty.
Right.
And when women have children, their wages drop 30% after giving birth, because there's an expectation that they're not going to give everything to the job. Whereas fathers are rewarded, and I haven't got the figures right in front of me, but their wages go up because there's still that expectation of the family wage earned by men. This gets really complicated. So this, heterosexual relationships.
Right.
When you look at working class women, for example, Black mothers, all of the different kinds of mothers and fathers and parenting there is, how much more complicated it is. Women are working 3 jobs just in order to put food on the table. Everything is stacked against you when you have a child, and yet society says that that's what all women want. Yeah, and we're expected to do it because we have to reproduce in order to keep the economy going. And I think that's the thing that really upsets me. It makes me so cross that America's reproduction rate is going down. And I just can't help but think that they need women to be having more babies, hence Roe versus Wade, hence trying to keep women in the home. Because if women stop reproducing because they say, you know what, economically, this is rubbish, then America's in trouble. because who's going to be working in the future to pay for the older people? We've already seen it in Japan. We see, you know, in other countries, Germany, where women have just said, no, we're not doing this anymore. Not all of them, thank goodness, but you know, it's intimately tied with the economic prosperity of a country.
Mm-hmm.
And yet people don't question the fact that it's women that are being told they have to stay at home with the child. It's just wrong.
And to both of your points, I don't know about your perspective, and I think you were in Great Britain when your children were young, but I know, given the age that Anne and I are, it was just shocking how much childcare cost to me.
Oh,
I didn't even think about it. We wanted children. It took us a while to have children. We were so happy to have children. And then, and I live in New Jersey. Most of my family is in Virginia. And luckily my mother comes, talk about caregiving. Like, my mother comes up about once a month still to help. But I just remember being flabbergasted. I just remember being astounded at how much it cost. And I'm a professional person. My husband at the time, he was passed away, he was an electrical engineer. Like, we were a 2-family income that had a lot of resources, and it was unbelievable.
yeah. I mean, impossible for me. I could not. I actually, my wages, because I wasn't then an academic, that's one of the reasons that I went back to university to, you know, get a job where I was off on the summer holidays. Now I know how hard scholars work. But my wages didn't even cover the childcare in England, because in England we've got the highest childcare in Europe, highest cost. So we're kind of not as bad. We do get maternity leave, but we're the worst off in Europe, even though we're not in Europe anymore. So let's just not talk about that either. Yeah.
And there's also, of course, elder care for caregiving as well. So in my case, I had, a terminally ill husband that was caregiving. So there's all of these facets of caregiving. Again, we don't want to necessarily say it's all about motherhood, but the price, and I know, and I hope you don't mind me sharing, but I know, like, with your family too, that the cost of elder care was astronomical.
Mm.
Like $5,000 a month. So that's, there's not a emphasis on, there's an emphasis on the family, but not a care of the family. There's an assumption that that will be free labor done by largely women.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's astounding.
One thing that I am interested, like, in some of the student questions, because I feel like we're kind of hitting a lot of the negative points.
Good.
So, I mean, I think one of the questions you had was, in your opinion, how can employers better support individuals who are balancing caregiving responsibilities with their careers? And so I think that I'm not sure what the careers of the folks who are on the call is, but I think it's interesting that all of us were professors. The kind of shift I took was in part because I sought flexibility. And so I think one thing as students are moving forward, is thinking about what would flexibility look like for you or for your partner. What is that like as you're doing career searches, like if people are doing informational interviews, to kind of put that as part of the list to ask questions. What is the possibility of flexibility for your kind of career trajectory? I mean, I think it's definitely based on, in some ways, the pressures of the state. So I know, like, in New Jersey, the New Jersey Family Leave Act, I think, was passed, but then according to Rutgers, there's basically a 1.7 million who are not protected. And so I do think career trajectories might look different depending on what state and what protections you have. But I wondered about, like, when I was trying to think of what students can do to kind of be proactive, because I think the JD Vance answer of live near your parents so the grandparents can take care is really a classist perspective that not everyone can do. And so for me, the one thing I was thinking of was career or job flexibility, and what does that look like?
Yeah,
Absolutely. Go
yeah.
ahead, Kim. Did you want to add to that?
No, I mean, I just think that's such a good point. And, it's, I honestly think one way forward is creches, childcare, employment, childcare, so that, you can take your baby to work. Again, looking back during the Second World War, that was provided.
Hmm.
They provided childcare because they knew that women needed to go into the factories in order for the husbands to go to war. So that, there was childcare provided. If you were really lucky, they'd do your shopping for you, that kind of thing. Yeah. And then that was yanked away when the men came back from war. And all of a sudden, the women were meant to be back in the home doing everything again. So I think it's a really good point. And I too would be really interested to hear what the younger generation are going to do, because I had my son when I was 28, and then I had my daughter when I was 2 months shy of 40. And I've got to tell you, in 12 years, nothing changed. And I've seen friends having babies now, and nothing has changed. So,
Yeah, I really like both of your points and Anne's point about the practicalities, because a lot of what we try to have these workshops be is, networking, but also practical advice for young people, regardless of gender identification, for moving through the workforce. So I think, yeah, Anne's point is really good about, that is a question that you might want to think about is, do you want to have children? Which do you have a partner and want to have children? If you are a partner, who's going to take those responsibilities? Where do you want to move? Because I think a lot of, for us, it just wasn't talked about. In fact, when we had our pre-meeting, we were talking about, because Anne and I both have children that have just gone off to college. I have several children, but one has moved away to college, and it's incredibly difficult in ways that people only sort of talk about. Oh, you're empty nester, you'll be sad. That's sort of, and then when we had the conversation with Kim was like, here's what you do. You just book in that worry. Like, Kim had all of this great, amazing advice, right? And so I think to have these conversations about practical things that we can do and how do we get it into, larger discourse is important. Anne, did you want to say something?
Well, that's just in the kind of the importance of conversations, I think also extends not just to career, but in terms of partnerships. Because the Pew study that I dropped in the chat said that mothers report taking on more childcare responsibilities, but fathers, again, opposite sex couples, say that the tasks are evenly split. So there's a disconnect there as well. So how do you kind of negotiate that? And I always feel like a prevent defense, maybe it's because I went to Penn State, I don't know, but I feel like having those conversations early, like
Yes.
what does it even look like to split? Because for me, it's always a kind of an emotional or even like an organizational task list that, like, I know who my son's doctors are, I know who the teachers are, but I'm not sure. And my husband's great, but I do not think he would have that knowledge. Whereas I would be like, oh yes, here, let me get that for you. And so that's an added kind of organizational like toolbox I carry with me. And sometimes I'd like to put it down.
yeah, it's emotional support, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's the thing that is, it's kind of invisible labor.
Yeah.
And I the same. I knew my kids' friends. I knew where they were. My husband's great, but my God, he didn't know where they were half the time because he just left it to me.
Arlie Hochschild has a really great, and this is an older book. This
Yeah.
is like, I think I read it in college. But Arlie Hochschild calls it the second shift. And I
Yeah,
think that's really helpful for people to think about. So it's okay for women to have careers. And then when you get home, you start your second shift, which is the caregiving.
yeah,
And again, especially for the students on the call, if you would like to put questions in the chat, we can make sure that we can get to them as well, because I think Professor Akass and Demo would like to hear about them too. Do you think, while we're waiting for some of those, I guess this is, well, it's a question for both of you. Do you think okay, so we're all sort of film scholars, like all of us have similar kinds of training, the three of us. And so we tend to be very wary of saying this particular media depiction is causing this particular outcome, right? Most of us don't really believe in causation, but what kinds of, culpability do you give to media portrayals in terms of the lack of resources and that sort of thing? I mean, since you're both media scholars, does that question make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I just think that we're in a different mediascape than what I grew up into.
Yes.
And so I feel like, and I don't know, Instagram, TikTok, I feel like that is the defining landscape. But I'm not really, wasn't my defining landscape. So I kind of would be interested in, younger people talking about the way in which that sets the norm for their kind of everyday mothering practices.
Mm.
And so, because I think that there is a kind of emphasis on perfectionism with regard to mothering, but I'm not sure if that is a, generational thing. So I think we also have to.
Yes, there's a couple questions coming here. Go ahead, Kim, and then we'll look.
I was going to say directly, I absolutely agree. And I just think you're absolutely right. I'm older now. I don't do social media, so I'd be really interested in that. What I would say is that I don't think that the media causes it. I think
Right.
it's a really intricate web. And I think the media perpetuates it because it's mainly white middle-class men that create the media.
Mm-hmm.
And, again, there's figures that suggest that, figures go up, more women work behind the scenes. I think it's like 30% of directors now in 1 year, and then they lose it again. So we're currently on a downslide again. And if you haven't got women behind the camera, if you haven't got working mothers behind the camera or behind the script, it's incredibly difficult because you just perpetuate what's going on. You just perpetuate your experience. And on the other hand, you get all the cultural commentators like journalists who absolutely shore up each other. And so I don't think I think it's much more complicated than saying the media causes it, because we know it doesn't, it's not a reflection and all of that stuff. But it is absolutely linked to how carers are portrayed on TV, film, and everywhere else.
I want to build on that because I think what's been normalized, it's the horizon of the taken for granted. There's not an expectation that parenting requires adequate supports.
Mm-hmm.
That's not part of the kind of narrative landscape. And so it seems normalized. We don't see a lot of those parental supports, adequate supports. And so I think in that sense, we don't question it because that's just set as the norm.
Yeah. And related to that, there's a question. It's actually from one of our interns, Simran, and it says, "What do you make of portrayals of mothers in media and television at the moment? And do you think these portrayals are moving to a more authentic place or otherwise?"
Well, it depends what you're watching. I mean, I think, network TV, for example, historically has portrayed this kind of 50s ideal, but it's a nostalgia for something that was never there anyway. So, that's clearly what men think women and families should look like. Nowadays, thank God we've got streaming and we've got so many different representations of women, more women moving into the arena to actually write. There's really good portrayals. I mean, I'm thinking, I can't think of anything, I never can. But Hacks, for example, Schitt's Creek, lots of the newer series don't judge women for not being perfect. They don't judge either. They just let it happen. Mayor of Easttown was another one that I thought was excellent because, she's a working mother. Her mother's there to help her, but, she's really imperfect. And I think we are seeing more imperfection on it, or imperfection. I don't mean that, but I think it is going in the right direction.
The one thing I think is missing is that there's an assumption that it's not all going to happen at once. So, I mean, at one point, my son was on the spectrum. We were arguing to get supports, and my mom was in a dementia unit, falling so regularly that they recognized me in the ER. So I don't think that media narratives are showing that's too narratively messy to show that those things, it's not like, okay, I'm done with this crisis. Now I'm going to do this one. There's, yes, exactly, the sandwich generation.
Yeah.
And I just think that it's much more overlap, and there's not, I think that makes it for a confusing narrative. So that's maybe why.
I agree, but I also think America is a specific case, because I think if you look to British TV, you got many more series of women with women and fathers who are parenting that are very imperfect. So it is a specifically American thing. The Nordic countries, it's much more allowable to be imperfect.
Yeah. Simran had followed up that she used to watch a show called Working Moms. I haven't seen that. Have you seen that? She said that she thought it was a good one. Here's another question. So what advice would you give to individuals who are trying to negotiate additional flexibility in their current role rather than changing careers or finding other employment opportunities? So we were talking about people when you go out to look, like what kind of flexibility. While many gained the ability to work from home during the pandemic, many industries are peeling back that flexibility. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, not that aren't depressing. I'll go over to Anne. I'll just, yeah, over to you, Anne.
Yeah. I mean, how I'm seeing it work, honestly, in the workspace I live in, is that, and this is probably not super empowering, is you make yourself invaluable and then you make the ask. So it's a very strategic timing thing where it's like, yeah, you need me and I need this. But that's really like, again, that is not adequate supports.
No.
That is strategic communication. So I mean, I think that's one of the problems. I mean, I think almost, I mean, I'm really glad we're talking about this as a media perspective, but I think sociologists and people in HR might have some really more nuts and bolts kinds of suggestions, but that is how I have seen it work in the different work settings that I am in. Not just, the school district, but in terms of the university setting, outside professors, but more, like administrative folk.
Yeah, and I would add, if you're lucky enough to work at a school that has a union, pressuring the union, constantly bothering the union. So I am the former promotion chair of the university, the Senate faculty. I was a full professor when I did this. So there's a dimension of having that power. And I don't know if any of those folks are on the call, but they can let you know that I was just a terrier about what it's just, and I stepped down because of my own mental health. But if you put those issues about maternity leave, for example, in front of the people, and you just keep asking, and that's been mine. And I know Dean Tweedy's on the call. I mean, he knows my MO fairly well. I just keep asking. I keep, you wear people down where you're like, what about this issue? What about this issue? And after a while, they're gonna need to hear it. But it's definitely complicated. There
Yeah, I
is
mean, I think,
unfortunately no good.
little ray of light on the horizon, but I quote this in my book, Biden's Families Act that he brought in, I think must have been 2 years ago, because it came in just at the tail end of when I was writing and I had to include it. But it absolutely acknowledges that this needs to be a societal issue, and it's not down to the individual, because then it becomes the individual against society, and you're never going to win. I would suggest that you have a mentorship program. Get women with the experience that will fight your corner. And as I was in my last job called a dog with a bone, they always used to send me in because I would just keep on and on and on. And it doesn't always work, but you need somebody that's more experienced of caring and working to know how to approach this, because I think it is such an institutionalized attitude that there needs to be a major shift institutionally and politically and economically, and from the government down, because it's impossible to try and climb that mountain on your own, or bandy together, get all the other mothers together.
Right.
That's
That's what I love that. Go ahead, Kim. I'm sorry I interrupted.
I was going to say, it's the power of the collective,
Mhm.
just, yeah. So
that's what was in my head. Is this idea of mentoring and finding mentors in your workplace. That's for young people as well. And we've had a lot of these workshops, and a lot of the people we might be talking about health and science communication or working in a medical publishing field. And lots of those individuals have talked about finding a mentor. That's part of the goal of our center, is to connect, younger people with people experienced in different industries, to have that mentorship and to have those social collectives of people. Like I said, I cannot tell you how helpful it was, just random conversation with Kim, who was like, oh, it's awful when your kid goes away to school. And I never, because it's not really talked about. And I was like really depressed. And it's like, it's awful. And here's a couple of things. So finding people in your networks, in your industry that can do that is really important. And that's funny, because another question was, how does one build a network of adequate support? So that's great. It's clear that when no one can do it alone, but many cannot afford paid help. In my community, many of the mothers in my age group, late 20s, early 30s, their parents and grandparents still work, right, and cannot provide the kind of support that is imagined of expected. Yeah. Can y'all speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly can, because my daughter was just going to playgroup when my mum died, and she was my principal carer, help with the caring. And I was caring for her as well. She was sick, but she was the one that could pick her up if I got stuck at work. And it was other mothers at the playgroup. And we used to trade, I'll pick yours up if you pick mine up. The working mums have to do that, because nobody can afford it. And you need to have that kind of network. I had to build it with other mothers. Yeah, that's.
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo the kind of a community of mothers you find. And so in that sense, for me, that was kind of through Facebook, kind of shared, but that's not sustainable. So I mean, I think that I really love that question, because I think it requires maybe even thinking about what is adequate support for you.
Yeah.
And being super clear about that. I mean, sometimes you don't know. I mean, if you have a child premature, adequate support, you might think you need this, and then the world turns upside down, and that's not required. But I do think the network, but that's why I'm really glad, Kim, you brought up the policy. But, so when New Jersey is talking about their New Jersey Family Leave Act, it's like paying attention to what is out there. Because one of the reasons I went into student support is because I now know my community really, really well.
Mm.
And my special skill is to be able to find the just right resource. So maybe there's a community organization that actually could offer you some kind of, a child care support, a loan. There are these things in our community, but I think we need to do better as advocates, like as your center, Julie, for kind of here's a running list of, if since we've done this Catch-22 program, here's a running list of potential resources in our larger community that might be useful to working mothers, and then maybe make that part of the website as well. Because I think when you're in trouble, it's not finding resources, it's finding the just right resource. And
Yeah.
so adequate support would be having some mentor group or community conversation about, okay, well, what are the resources in our community?
Yeah.
What is the Faculty Senate doing to share the resources for grad students or undergrads who are parents? What does that look like in our community?
Mhm. Right. And publicizing it too, because we have a child care center on campus that I think a lot of it's intended for students with children, but I think a lot of our students don't know that it even exists,
Mm.
you know?
I
And yeah, and then I'm sorry to hear about Simran's father passing away, and many people on this call know that my husband passed away. So even the best laid plans of mice and men is, you're going to have two caregivers and you're going to do this, and then he got sick and I had to care for him and three small children, and so you plan, but you also recognize that there are going to be things that happen along the way.
yeah.
Um, and
Yeah.
finding that network, right, and coming to places like our center or finding other places in the community, I think.
Yeah. I think
um
so. If I can just say, it's not just about childcare. I mean, I'm glad you brought that up about when your kids leave home. There is no narrative that explains what it's like
no.
when you've got adult kids, because they're not quite adult, going to university and how bereft you are. And I think that really points to having a network for yourself. Have other women to talk to, other women that have been through the same experience with really practical help, practical advice. And just to know that, just to hear somebody else saying the thing
Yes.
that you're feeling is so important. That's held me up through so many terrible things. So, don't forget yourself. Don't become so self-effacing in your role as a carer that you forget that you need help. Put your own mask on before you put it on somebody else's.
It's so important, and I'm going to out you and talk about how you had to move your yoga mat before we got on the call. But self-care, right? And I think, and it's so easy, and we hear it and people are like, and I know lots of, like, my doctors have told me you need to do yoga and I need to take better care of myself, but there is this narrative of sacrifice, that we have, and also of just being so busy trying to juggle the balls that it's
Yeah.
difficult sometimes to think about caring
Yeah.
for yourself. I want to make sure, were there any other questions that either you saw in the chat or the students had that you wanted to get to? Because we're coming up on the hour. And then I also wanted to ask Anne about her role as a school board member and how you see that. Has that impacted the way that you?
I mean, I think that kind of relates to one of the questions that you shared, that maybe the students shared, which was something about how, what role do you think communication plays in managing the demands of caregiving and professional life? I mean, I think that caregiving role allows me to be a better steward in our community and a better listener when I'm trying to negotiate different stakeholders in really kind of difficult situations, and to kind of be a listener versus a reactor. So, I mean, I think all those skills that you hone as a caregiver can make for better policy.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I always think, mothers are so good at juggling. Multitasking is what it used to be called, but juggling. We know how to get through a day with this to do, that to do. That, you really have to draw on that skill in a job like yours. And I think for me, when my kids went to university, it absolutely enhanced my understanding of student life and what it was like to be a student.
Yes.
Because I've always been a parent as a professor, but it's knowing how vulnerable my daughter, especially my daughter, was when she went to university. And I'd always thought, well, the first years they're just away from their parents and they're kind of, yay, party, all of that stuff. And actually, she needed more care than ever before, and it's not practical caring. So I think that has really helped me with students to know that they're not just there, they've got whole lives going on. If they don't turn up for class, it's not just because they can't be bothered. It's maybe they're curled up in that anxious ball somewhere crying. I think that really helps my role. Yeah.
I think that's excellent. We had one last question about, and Princess Paul says, could you speak to managing, and again, I'm sorry for your loss, Princess, could you speak to managing caring for the life of another during the end of their life and caring for yourself? I will speak for myself. You have to be vulnerable enough to accept help from other people. You have to just let go.
Yeah.
There is no template, by the way. There's different ways that people pass, and there's different circumstances, and so there is no one size fits all, or I would have written the book. I do feel like Ann and I could probably do this better, like a guide to emergency rooms. I feel like there's things that you should always have in your car in case, because you're going to have to go to the emergency room. It's like a sweater and some change for the vending machines. But this idea that, and you just are so exhausted, but you just, people brought meals for us, and I resisted that for a while. And I was like, we're fine, and we can, and then you just have to let people bring you food. You just have to let people take your children. If you have children at the time, you just have to let go of that, because you will become so physically ill that you can't. It is cliche, but what Kim said about putting the mask on yourself first is true, because you can't help other people if you're ill. And it is difficult to practice what you preach on that. I struggle constantly with self-care. Many people that know me on this call will attest to, I struggle very much with that. So yeah, any thoughts from you or Kim or Ann?
Oh God, yeah. I just say that somebody once said to me that when you give birth to guilt. You are just, so I would say, get rid of guilt. Don't feel the guilt. Just know that you're doing your best, and you can only do your best. Don't feel guilty about shortchanging anyone. You just have to do your best that you can for yourself.
Ann, did you want to say anything?
I think you guys, it's just brutal. And so, in that moment, like my thing is like, yeah, I'm going to Instacart every day. Like, I don't care. But I could do that because I had the economics to be able to kind of just put it on my credit card. But I was able to kind of I push through. It is really hard. Like, to me, the best kind of advice for me was to be outside. That was my only reset, to just go outside. And then to get help. Or if, like, for me, I was new to the area, so my help was the Instacart. So that's going to look different to different people.
Right. And, professional help if you can afford it. And I was seeing a therapist at the time who said, we're not using like plates and forks that you have to wash. You're buying all plastic forks and in plastic plates, And that's our warning. But literally, I was like, that's terrible for the environment. I'm not buying. And she was like, this is what's happening. You're buying 100 styrofoam if you have 2 plates, cup, all disposable. So you could just throw it away. And it got me through. And it's just like a little bit of a, and you will find your way.
There's a lovely scene in The Fabelmans, if you've seen that, the film about Steven, where the mother, they lays the tablecloth, and then at the end of the meal just picks everything up and just throws it away.
Yeah.
And this is really important. Thank you, Simon, for mentioning that therapy at Rowan, and I'm sure many of the other colleges here is free. And I know that's becoming difficult to find. So it's, and I look at it this way: it's not free because you paid that tuition and those activities fees, so you're paying for your therapy. So to reach out to those resources as well. Any last thoughts, Anne and Kim, that you wanted to talk about before we end the meeting? Thank you so much for your time. Anything?
Just find solidarity with others, and that can be also in the community, like finding someone, a mentor, an organization that will help you find the just right resource that will help you kind of imagine what adequate support looks like for you.
Yeah, that's great advice, Anne. And for me, I would say, don't be embarrassed about asking for help. Don't be embarrassed about crying at the school gates because you can't possibly cope anymore. If you feel like that, you can bet your bottom dollar that there is at least one other person, and it's the sisterhood. Maybe men will help, but I think it's that community of women. Don't get rid of embarrassment.
Yeah. And I will just add as a reminder that we aren't just talking about specifically motherhood, and that everyone has issues and everyone will find themselves in a space where they are needing to care for others. And so I do think it's important. I have some single female friends who sometimes feel guilty and put upon because their friends are asking them to do childcare, or they want, if you have no children or you have no one to care, it's not, you don't have it easy either. Like, I think we need to emphasize that. Like, everyone has these things that they have. And that doesn't mean people, women that don't have children are less human or less busy or less. I think that's important in the current climate to talk about.
We could have a whole nother hour on single cat ladies, childless cat ladies, but
right. We really could. The time flew by. Thank you so much for your expertise and your participation. We will have a recording of this. If you would like to have it, you can email me at haynes@rowan.edu. I know several people have asked. If you just reach out, I'll send you the recording. Again, Anne and Kim, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's been on the call. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for inviting us, Julie. It's been lovely. I've really enjoyed it.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.